The night I heard my 70-year-old mother sobbing outside my bedroom door. I didn't open it, and that was the moment I stopped being a son and started becoming a monster. I'm 38 years old now, and no matter how many years pass, I still hear that sound like it's trapped inside the walls of my skull, the quiet, shaking sob of my 70-year-old mother standing outside my bedroom door at 11:47 p.m., whispering my name as if she needed permission to exist in a house that had my name on the mortgage. She wasn't asking for money, she wasn't asking for comfort. She was asking if she could use the upstairs bathroom because my wife, Emily, had made a rule that my parents weren't allowed up there after 9 at night, and instead of opening that door, instead of stepping into the hallway and reminding the world that she was my mother, I stayed in bed pretending to sleep while Emily lay beside me scrolling through her phone, satisfied and silent. And I told myself I was preserving my marriage, protecting peace, choosing the woman I vowed to spend my life with. But if I strip away every excuse, every rationalization, every lie I told myself in the mirror, the truth is brutally simple. I chose the person who made me feel important over the people who actually made me who I am. My parents moved into our finished suburban basement in Naperville after my father's stroke left him partially paralyzed and struggling to speak. And at first I told everyone it was temporary, that it was the right thing to do, that family takes care of family. And Emily smiled politely in public, calling them sweet, but behind closed doors she would sigh dramatically when my dad's cane tapped too loudly on the floor. She would complain that my mother's cooking smelled old. She would say our friends would think we were unsuccessful if they knew my parents lived downstairs. And every time she said those things, she'd look at me, waiting to see which side I'd stand on, and instead of correcting her, I laughed nervously and changed the subject. I started making small compromises that felt harmless at first, asking my parents to text before coming upstairs, suggesting they eat dinner earlier so Emily and I could have alone time, moving their laundry schedule to weekdays only, and I convinced myself these were boundaries. Healthy adult boundaries, not humiliation, not exile, not the slow erosion of dignity. But then Emily began documenting everything, installing a small security camera near the basement entrance for safety, locking the pantry at night and accusing my parents of sneaking snacks, telling me she found food missing even when I knew we hadn't bought anything new. And when my mother tried to explain that my father needed a late-night cracker with his medication to avoid nausea, Emily rolled her eyes and said, if they can't follow simple rules, maybe they shouldn't be here. And I felt something twist inside me, not anger at my wife, but irritation at my parents for making things difficult, as if their aging bodies were a personal attack on my peace. The worst part is that I didn't yell at them, I didn't curse them out, I didn't slam doors. I did something more destructive. I became cold, measured, managerial, correcting my father's slurred words in front of guests, telling my mother to respect the house when she left a glass in the sink, explaining to them in calm corporate tones that Emily felt disrespected, and each time my mother's eyes filled with confusion, as if she couldn't recognize the boy she used to hold when he had nightmares. I hardened myself by thinking this was adulthood, this was marriage, this was loyalty. Emily fed that narrative carefully, praising me when I sided with her, whispering at night that I was finally putting our family first. And that word "our" became a weapon that excluded the two people downstairs. And I let it, because being admired by my wife felt powerful. It felt like I was finally a man who had built something of his own, not just the son of immigrants who worked double shifts and saved every penny to send me to college. The humiliation escalated so gradually that I barely noticed the cruelty: separate groceries labeled with sticky notes, a rule that my parents couldn't answer the front door, subtle comments at church about stress at home because of aging relatives, and when neighbors stopped inviting my parents to block barbecues because Emily hinted they were unpredictable. I didn't correct the narrative. I allowed it to breathe, to spread, to calcify. I remember one Saturday afternoon when my father tried to join us in the backyard while I was grilling, leaning heavily on his cane, and Emily leaned into me and murmured, "Please don't let him embarrass us." And instead of wrapping an arm around my dad and introducing him proudly, I walked over and gently suggested he rest downstairs because the sun was too strong, and he nodded, pretending to understand, pretending it was about weather and not shame. I watched him disappear back into the basement sliding door like a guest overstaying his welcome in the house he once dreamed I would own. And that image should have broken me. But I told myself it was temporary, that once his health improved, once things stabilized, once Emily felt secure, everything would soften. But nothing softened, it sharpened. The night my mother stood outside my door crying, It wasn't just about the bathroom, it was about months of swallowed pride. About being told to keep the TV volume low because it irritated Emily. About being asked to use paper plates so dishes wouldn't pile up. About feeling like tenants who forgot to pay rent in a home their son claimed was built from his hard work alone. I heard her whisper, "I'm sorry, I didn't want to wake you," and I lay there staring at the ceiling while my wife remained still beside me. And in that silence I felt versions of myself fighting the son who wanted to leap out of bed and hold his mother, and the husband who feared disappointing the woman beside him, and I chose fear. I chose comfort, I chose the easier loyalty. I told myself my parents were strong, that they'd survive a little discomfort, that marriage required sacrifices, but I never admitted that the sacrifices were always coming from the same side. When the crying stopped and I heard her slow footsteps retreat down the hallway toward the basement stairs, something irreversible shifted inside me. A quiet acceptance that I was no longer protecting peace but enforcing injustice, and yet I still didn't move. Because acknowledging that would mean confronting Emily, risking conflict, risking the version of myself I had built as the decisive, successful provider. That was the night I crossed from weakness into complicity, from confusion into choice, and if I'm honest, it wasn't a single dramatic decision, but a collection of small surrenders stacked on top of each other until they formed a wall between me and the people who loved me first. Years later, after everything collapsed, after the lies, the accusations, the public shame that would eventually follow, I traced the origin of my destruction back to that hallway, to that closed bedroom door, to the sound of my mother apologizing for needing something as basic as dignity. And I realized that before anyone betrayed me, before any accusation was made, before my reputation was dragged through the mud, I had already betrayed myself by silencing the part of me that knew this was wrong. And the tragedy is that I understood it even then. I just didn't have the courage to act in that cowardice. More than any future scandal or lawsuit was the seed of everything that would come next. The humiliation didn't stay contained inside our house. It bled into the streets, into church pews, into grocery store aisles. Because Emily made sure it did, and I let her. I stood beside her while she carefully rewrote the story of my parents into something ugly and dangerous. Something that justified everything we were doing to them. She started small, telling women at church that my father's stroke had changed his personality, that he had unpredictable mood swings, that she sometimes felt nervous being alone in the house with him. And she would say it with this trembling vulnerability that made people lean in closer, made them protective of her, and I would nod quietly, adding just enough detail to make it believable without sounding cruel, saying things like, "It's been hard on all of us," or "We're trying to manage it," as if my father's slurred speech and slow steps were signs of some hidden violence. Within weeks the whispers began. Neighbors stopped waving at my parents when they checked the mailbox, invitations stopped coming, and I noticed the way people looked at me with sympathy instead of respect. Like I was carrying some secret burden, and instead of correcting them, instead of defending the two people who had defended me my entire life, I leaned into it because it made me feel like a devoted husband protecting his fragile wife. My mother found out before I expected her to. She printed screenshots from the neighborhood Facebook group where Emily had posted vague warnings about elderly relatives with cognitive issues and the importance of keeping children safe, and she came upstairs one afternoon holding those papers and shaking hands, asking me if it was true, if I really believed my father was a threat, and I remember looking at her, really looking at the wrinkles around her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture from caring for my dad day and night, and instead of telling her she was being lied about, I told her she was overreacting, that social media always twists things, that she shouldn't dig for problems, and when she said, "We have done nothing to deserve this," I snapped back. Then stop acting like victims, and the silence that followed felt like something holy had just shattered. 2 weeks later Emily executed the move that destroyed whatever was left of my integrity. She waited until I was at work, waited until I was in the middle of a meeting, and then she called me hysterical, saying my father had shoved her during an argument about the thermostat, that he got angry and pushed her arm, and before I could even process it, she hung up and dialed 911. I drove home with my heart pounding, not because I believed my father was capable of it, but because I knew what police cars in a suburban driveway would mean, what neighbors would see, what stories would spread. And when I turned onto our street and saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the houses, I felt something inside me sink into a place it would never climb out of. My father was sitting on a patio chair in the front yard, cane resting against his leg, to officers standing over him asking slow, deliberate questions as if he were a suspect in a crime he could barely pronounce. And Emily stood a few feet away clutching her arm, showing a purpling bruise that I would later realize had the distinct shape of fingers pressed deliberately into skin. I should have walked straight to my father, should have stood beside him and demanded evidence, should have said, "This is impossible," but instead I walked toward Emily first, asked her if she was okay, asked her what happened, and she cried into my chest loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, whispering that she felt scared in her own home. When the officer asked me if my father had ever been aggressive before, I hesitated, and that hesitation was all it took, because silence can be interpreted as confirmation. And in that moment I betrayed him more deeply than any accusation ever could. I turned to my father and asked, quietly, "Dad, did you touch her?" And I will carry the look he gave me until the day I die. Not anger, not even hurt, but confusion. Like he was searching my face for the little boy who used to run into his arms after school, and not finding him. He tried to speak, his words tangled from the stroke, saying something like "no, never, son," and I saw the officer glance at Emily as if to measure credibility. Strong healthy woman versus elderly disabled man, and the narrative was already decided. They didn't arrest him. There wasn't enough evidence, but they filed a report. They took statements, and that was enough, because in suburbia perception is verdict. And Emily made sure to cry just loudly enough as they left. Made sure to say she didn't feel safe. Made sure the neighbors saw her trembling hands. That night, after the street returned to quiet and the porch lights went off one by one, I went downstairs and told my parents it might be best if they stayed somewhere else for a little while. Just until things cooled down, just until Emily felt comfortable again. And my mother stared at me as if she were waiting for the punchline to a cruel joke. But there was none, only my cowardice standing between us. She didn't argue, she didn't scream. She simply nodded and began packing my father's medications into a plastic grocery bag, because that's what they had always done in emergencies. Survived quietly, and my father struggled to put on his jacket, his hands shaking not from illness but from humiliation. And I stood there pretending this was temporary, pretending I was protecting everyone, pretending this was fairness. When the rideshare arrived, I helped my father down the front steps, aware of curtains shifting in neighboring windows, aware that every movement was being observed, judged, stored away as confirmation of some dark story about my family. And as my mother settled into the back seat, she looked at me through the open door and said, "We never raised you to be afraid of the truth," and the sentence hit me harder than any accusation could have. Because she wasn't angry, she was disappointed. And disappointment from a parent carries a weight that anger never could. I watched the car drive away, taillights disappearing at the end of the street. And instead of chasing it, instead of calling them back, I walked inside and locked the door, choosing the quiet approval of my wife over the dignity of my parents. And that was the last time I saw my father standing upright in front of our home. The last time I had the chance to undo what I had started. The last moment before the consequences began accelerating toward me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Because I thought removing them would solve the tension. I thought sacrificing them would stabilize my marriage. But all I had done was prove to Emily that I was willing to abandon anyone for her. And once she knew that, once she understood that my loyalty could be weaponized, I had already signed away more than my parents' place in my home. I had signed away my own. 3 months after I forced my parents out of my house and into that cheap roadside motel off Route 59, my father died in a room that smelled like bleach and stale cigarettes. And I didn't even know he was gone until 2 days after they buried him, because Emily told my mother not to create drama by calling me, said it would only stress me out at work. And when my sister finally reached me from an unknown number because I had blocked her during one of her furious attempts to confront me, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room discussing quarterly projections while my father's body was already in the ground. I remember stepping into the hallway to take the call, irritated at first, ready to defend my choices again. But the second I heard my sister's voice cracked, hollow. Beyond anger, I knew something irreversible had happened, and when she said, "Dad's gone," there was no dramatic music, no cinematic collapse, just a strange ringing in my ears as if the world had pressed mute on everything except guilt. I drove to the cemetery in a daze. Arriving late, my tie still knotted from work, and I saw my mother standing beside a modest grave with only a few relatives around her. Because word travels fast in suburbs, and scandals shrink attendance. And I could feel the whispers circling me like insects. "That's the son, the one whose wife called the cops, The father who got violent, and I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that none of it was true. But the reality was I had allowed the lie to live long enough that it had become stronger than any truth I could offer. When I approached my mother, she didn't slap me, didn't curse me, didn't accuse me. She simply looked smaller than I remembered, as if grief had physically reduced her, and said, "He kept asking if you were busy," and that sentence hollowed me out because even in the motel, even after the humiliation, even after being escorted out of my house under suspicion, my father had defended me in his mind, had assumed I was just overwhelmed, just occupied. Not that I had chosen silence over him. Standing there staring at freshly turned soil, I realized I hadn't just lost a father, I had stolen his last months of dignity. I had made him feel like a liability instead of a parent. And yet, and this is the part that still disgusts me, I didn't confront Emily when I got home. I didn't explode, didn't demand answers, because facing her would have meant admitting I had built this tragedy with my own hands. So instead I folded into her arms when she said she was sorry for my loss, and I let her tell me that sometimes distance is necessary, that my father's stress had been self-inflicted, that guilt would only poison our future. That's when the second betrayal began, and it wasn't loud or chaotic like police sirens. It was quiet, methodical, almost clinical, like a surgeon operating without anesthesia. Emily offered to simplify our finances since I was grieving, said she could handle the accounts, the mortgage, the investments, and I agreed because delegating felt easier than thinking, because spreadsheets were safer than memories. And gradually every account password changed to something I didn't know. Every statement came through her email, every bill required her explanation. She convinced me to refinance the house solely in her name for tax efficiency, told me her credit score would secure better rates. And when I hesitated, she tilted her head and said, "After everything I went through with your father, I thought you trusted me." And that sentence wrapped around my shame like a leash, pulling me forward into compliance. Then she introduced her wellness startup, a lifestyle brand she said would empower women recovering from trauma. And she needed capital, seed money, belief. And I had savings, years of bonuses, and careful investments my parents had once celebrated. And when I suggested we consult a financial advisor, she grew cold, accused me of doubting her ambition, of undermining her healing, and reminded me again how she had felt unsafe in her own home because I didn't protect her, twisting my grief into obligation. And I signed the transfer forms because I thought supporting her would balance the cosmic scale of what I'd done to my parents. Meanwhile, my sister's calls became more desperate, accusing me of abandoning our mother in her loneliness, of rewriting history to protect my marriage. And instead of listening, I blocked her again, telling myself she was projecting pain onto me, telling myself she just didn't understand adult relationships. And one by one I severed the remaining threads that connected me to anyone who might question Emily's narrative. Months passed in a blur of performative stability, curated Instagram posts about entrepreneurship, polite smiles at church, quiet dinners where Emily praised my growth, until the afternoon my assistant walked into my office and said HR needed to see me immediately. And there's a specific tone people use when something is very wrong, but they're not allowed to say it, and I heard it in her voice. I sat across from two representatives and a compliance officer who avoided eye contact as they slid a folder toward me containing printed emails I had written, bank transfer records from corporate accounts I oversaw, and a formal complaint alleging domestic instability and potential financial misconduct. And I remember feeling confused at first because the emails were mine, but not mine, sentences rearranged, context stripped, sarcasm turned into threat. And the bank transfers were real, but framed as suspicious movements rather than approved transactions. The complaint was anonymous but detailed, referencing personal tensions at home, implying I was volatile, distracted, ethically compromised. And as I flipped through the pages, my mouth went dry, because there was only one person who had access to my personal emails, my home computer. My emotional vulnerabilities, only one person who could stitch together a narrative convincing enough to trigger an internal investigation. They placed me on immediate administrative leave pending review, escorted me out discreetly but visibly enough that rumors would ignite. And as I sat in my car gripping the steering wheel, I felt the first crack in the illusion I had built around my marriage. I drove home slower than I ever had, every red light stretching into accusation. And when I walked through the front door, Emily was at the kitchen island scrolling on her phone, calm, composed, almost amused. And I didn't yell, I didn't accuse, I simply asked, "Did you send something to my company?" And she looked up at me with a softness that felt rehearsed and said, I needed to protect myself before you turned on me like you did your parents. And in that moment, the entire architecture of my loyalty collapsed. Because she wasn't denying it, she wasn't even hiding it. She was reframing it as self-defense. She explained patiently, as if to a child, that she had to establish a record. That men under pressure become unpredictable. That if our marriage ever deteriorated, she needed documentation. And she said it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And I understood with terrifying clarity that every confession I had ever made to her about my guilt, my fear, my insecurities had been archived as ammunition. I realized then that the loyalty I had sacrificed my parents for was never mutual. It was transactional, conditional, strategic. And the worst part wasn't that she had betrayed me, it was that I had taught her she could. Because I had shown her I would abandon blood for approval, that I would trade integrity for validation. And once someone sees that in you, once they understand your weakness, they don't love you through it, they leverage it. Within weeks, my life didn't just crack, it detonated in public, methodically, humiliatingly, in ways I didn't even know were possible. Because Emily didn't just file for divorce, she declared war. I was served at my office building on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the lobby, in front of 2 coworkers and a receptionist who tried not to stare. And when I opened the envelope, my hands trembling, I saw not just divorce papers but a request for a restraining order citing emotional abuse, complete with a carefully assembled timeline painting me as unstable, volatile, and dangerous, and attached to it like a final insult was the same police report she had filed against my father, framed as evidence of a documented family pattern of aggression, as if dysfunction were genetic, as if cruelty ran in my blood. I felt the air leave my lungs reading words that described me as manipulative, intimidating, financially reckless, and I kept thinking there had to be a mistake, that this was some grotesque exaggeration that would fall apart under scrutiny. But Emily had spent months building a paper trail, planting narratives, and when the temporary restraining order was granted before I could even respond, I was legally forced out of the house I had paid for, but signed over in blind trust. I packed the suitcases while she stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom, arms crossed, calm and composed, and told me, "This is what happens when someone shows you who they really are." And I wanted to scream that I had shown her loyalty, not cruelty, that I had sacrificed my parents for her comfort. But the words felt pathetic even in my own head, because loyalty without integrity is just weakness in disguise. When I stepped onto the sidewalk with my bags, neighbors pretended to check their mail or water their lawns, eyes flicking toward me then away, and I could feel the judgment radiating from behind curtains. Because in suburban America, once the phrase restraining order attaches to your name, you don't get the benefit of the doubt, you become a cautionary tale. I tried calling friends that evening from the parking lot of a motel, but conversations were short, strained, polite in that distant way that signals withdrawal. And one of them finally admitted he had seen posts circulating online about me, threads speculating about my abusive history, anonymous comments suggesting there were multiple victims, and I realized Emily hadn't just filed paperwork, she had ignited a narrative. My company placed me on unpaid leave pending the outcome of the restraining order hearing, citing reputational risk. And then the internal audit concluded that the suspicious transactions tied to her startup, the ones she had orchestrated through accounts I technically oversaw, violated compliance policy. And just like that, after 15 years of clean performance reviews and promotions, I was terminated in a brief, sanitized email thanking me for my service. I remember sitting in my car staring at that message, feeling something inside me collapse inward, because I had spent my entire adult life building stability, climbing ladders, paying mortgages, proving I was successful enough to deserve love. And in a matter of weeks it was all erased, reduced to headlines and community gossip and legal jargon in court filings. Legal fees began draining what little money remained in accounts I could still access. And every consultation with an attorney began with the same cautious question, is there any truth to these allegations? And even though I answered no, I heard the doubt underneath, because Emily's documentation was detailed, emotional, persuasive, and I had no proof yet that it was fabricated. The worst part wasn't the financial loss or even the professional humiliation, it was the isolation. The way people who once hugged me at church now avoided eye contact. The way parents subtly steered their kids away when I walked into a coffee shop. The way my name felt contaminated. And I understood then what my father must have felt sitting on that patio chair with officers looming over him. The quiet suffocation of being judged before you're heard. Nights in that motel blurred together, fluorescent lights humming above me as I replayed every decision that led here. Every time I dismissed my sister's warnings, every time I silenced my conscience, every time I chose comfort over courage. And for the first time I allowed myself to consider that this wasn't random misfortune, it was consequence. Still, pride kept me from making the one call I knew I needed to make. Because how do you dial the number of the woman you exiled and say, "You were right"? How do you admit that the monster she watched you become has now turned on himself? But desperation has a way of dissolving ego. And one night after a court notice confirmed the restraining order would remain in place pending further review, I found myself staring at my mother's contact name on my phone, my thumb hovering for what felt like hours before finally pressing call. She answered on the second ring, her voice small but steady, and the second I heard her say, "Hello," something in me fractured completely, because I didn't deserve warmth, I didn't deserve concern, I didn't deserve anything but silence, and yet she gave me presence. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. Years of suppressed guilt erupting into sobs I couldn't control. And I expected her to remind me of the basement rules, the police cars, the motel room where my father died. But instead she asked only one question, soft and immediate: "Are you safe?" And that question, that simple, maternal reflex, undid me more violently than any accusation Emily had filed, because it proved that love had remained intact even when I had not. Within 48 hours my sister, the same sister I had blocked and dismissed as dramatic, drove 6 hours through the night to pick me up from that motel parking lot. Didn't lecture me, didn't throw my past in my face, just loaded my suitcases into her trunk and said, "You're coming with me," and my uncle, who had quietly observed the family fracture without interfering, contacted a lawyer he trusted, someone willing to dig into financial records, metadata, timestamps, someone who didn't just glance at Emily's narrative and accept it as truth. As they began gathering bank statements, email logs, security footage, I watched from the sidelines, ashamed and stunned, because the very people I had humiliated, displaced, and doubted were now mobilizing to defend me, not with words but with action. Not because I deserved it, but because blood, real blood, doesn't evaporate under pressure. Sitting at my sister's kitchen table late one night, surrounded by stacks of documents and legal pads filled with notes, I realized something that hurt more than the divorce, more than the job loss, more than the public shame. The monster I had become: the son who closed his door on his crying mother, the husband who chose image over integrity, had never stopped being loved by the very hearts he crushed. And that realization didn't feel comforting, it felt devastating. Because it meant my downfall wasn't proof that love had failed me, it was proof that I had failed love first. The legal battle lasted a year, and I need you to understand something before I tell you how it ended. There was no triumphant courtroom moment where I stood tall and reclaimed my dignity. No cinematic applause, no victorious music swelling in the background. It was slow, exhausting, humiliating, and every hearing forced me to sit quietly while lawyers read aloud the worst possible version of me as if it were fact. As if I had always been that man, and the only reason I survived it was because the very people I once abandoned refused to abandon me. My sister became relentless, the kind of relentless I used to call dramatic. Tracking down security footage from a neighbor's outdoor camera that captured the afternoon Emily claimed my father shoved her, footage that showed no confrontation, no physical contact, only my father standing unsteadily near the kitchen doorway, while Emily moved aggressively around him before disappearing briefly into the bathroom, where she later emerged with that perfectly shaped bruise. My uncle's lawyer dug into financial records and discovered transfers from the startup account into a separate business account registered under Emily's maiden name. A detail so calculated it made me physically ill, because it meant she had never built a dream, she had built an exit plan. Forensic analysis of my emails revealed edits, altered timestamps, entire paragraphs spliced together to create threats that never existed. And watching those findings unfold in court didn't feel satisfying, it felt devastating. Because every revelation confirmed that I had trusted someone who saw me not as a partner, but as a resource to be mined and discarded. When the restraining order was finally dropped due to lack of credible evidence, I expected relief, but instead I felt hollow. Because by then my job was gone, my reputation in the community had been shredded beyond repair. And whispers don't disappear just because paperwork changes. Some people still look at me like I got lucky, like technicalities saved me. Emily eventually faced charges for filing a false police report and financial fraud. And I sat in that courtroom as she avoided my eyes. No longer the trembling victim, but the exposed architect of chaos. And I should tell you, I felt vindicated. But what I felt was grief for my father who never lived to see the truth surface. Grief for my mother who had to testify about the night she cried outside my bedroom door while I stayed silent. Her voice shaking not from fear of Emily but from the memory of her own son choosing not to open the door. When the judge asked her why she continued supporting me despite everything, she said something that broke whatever pride I had left, because he is still my son, even when he forgets how to be one, and I lowered my head because redemption isn't earned in courtrooms. It's earned in kitchens, in quiet mornings, in consistent presence, and I had been absent when it mattered most. After the divorce was finalized, after assets were divided, and what little remained of my savings evaporated into legal fees, I moved into a small two-bedroom rental 15 minutes from my mother's apartment. 38 years old and starting over like a man half my age, except heavier, slower, marked. I sold my car to cover debts, took consulting work far below the executive title I once flaunted, and every morning I wake up before sunrise to drive my mother to her part-time job at a local library because she insists on staying busy. And sometimes when she sits in the passenger seat adjusting her seatbelt with those careful, aging hands, I see flashes of the woman who stood outside my bedroom door asking permission to use her own son's bathroom, and the shame hits me fresh every single time. I cook for her now simple meals, nothing fancy the way she used to cook for me when we couldn't afford much, but she made it feel like abundance. And we eat at a small wooden table near the window, sunlight spilling in, and she talks about ordinary things. Neighbors, books she shelved, weather forecasts, never once weaponizing the past against me. And that mercy is harder to carry than anger would have been. My sister visits often, still fierce, still protective. And sometimes I catch her watching me as if measuring whether I've truly changed. And I don't blame her, because words are cheap and I spent years using them to justify cowardice. I became a monster long before Emily betrayed me. I became one the moment I chose silence over truth, image over integrity, comfort over courage, and everything that followed. The public humiliation, the job loss, the legal devastation, was not random cruelty from the universe, but the echo of my own decisions. The people I pushed aside, the ones I labeled inconvenient, emotional, burdensome, were the only ones who stood between me and complete annihilation. And they didn't defend me because I deserved it, they defended me because love, real love, doesn't evaporate when tested, it reveals itself. I will never get to apologize to my father in a way that changes anything. Never get to tell him I see now what he endured quietly. Never get to undo the moment I asked him if he touched my wife, as if I truly believed he could. And that is a weight I will carry into every future version of myself. Sometimes at night, when the apartment is quiet and the city hum fades into the background, I replay the sound of my mother crying outside my door, and I force myself not to look away from it. Because that sound is my reminder, my scar, my warning of who I can become if I ever trade integrity for validation again. I did not when I survived, I learned. I was forgiven by people who had every right not to forgive me, and now my life is not about reclaiming status or reputation, but about showing up consistently for the woman who never stopped answering my calls. About becoming dependable instead of impressive. About understanding that strength is not defending your ego, but protecting the people who protected you first. If you're listening to me now, years later, understand that betrayal doesn't always begin with someone else. Sometimes it begins the moment you choose the wrong voice to trust. And by the time the truth surfaces, the damage you've done to the right voices can never be fully undone. Morally silenced the voices that loved me, and amplified the one that destroyed me. I defended a lie because it was easier than facing the truth. If you ever stand between loyalty and ego, choose the people who were there before you had anything, because once they're gone, no apology in the world will bring them back. If this confession shook you, if it made you think about your own choices, please like, share, and comment below. And if you want to see more stories like this or even have your own featured, subscribe to my channel.